Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Mallory Howard. I'm the assistant curator here at the Mark Twain House Museum. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for a special edition of our Trouble Begins lecture series. A few things of note before I introduce tonight's honored guests. First, please silence your cell phones, watches, anything that makes noise, buzzes, beeps. That would be great. We will be doing a Q&A from the audience at the conclusion of the conversation tonight, so think of a good question to ask. We will take questions both from our live audience and for everyone viewing at home. I will be in the audience along with a colleague to help facilitate that. We just please ask that you wait until you have a microphone until you begin asking your questions so that everyone at home can hear it as well. Tonight's event is, of course, free to the public, so we appreciate any donations you may be generous enough to make. That includes becoming a member of the Mark Twain House and Museum if you are not already. You can inquire at the ticket desk for more information about that. And of course, make sure you join our email list to stay up to date on all our upcoming events and programs. And you can also, of course, visit www.marktwainhouse.org. So now it is truly an honor to introduce both of our speakers tonight, Dr. Kerry Driscoll and Dr. Bob Hirst. Both have been instrumental in the field of Mark Twain studies, and they have always been very gracious with their time and with sharing their incredible knowledge. It is a real treat to welcome them tonight. Kerry Driscoll is professor of English Emerita at the University of St. Joseph in West Hartford, Connecticut. She is now an associate editor at the Mark Twain Papers Project at the University of California, Berkeley. Kerry is a longtime Twain scholar and the author of Mark Twain Among the Indians and Other Indigenous Peoples, the first book-length study of the writer's vexed representations of Native peoples over the course of his 50-year career. In 2022, she received the Mark Twain Circle of America's Louis J. Budd Award for Distinguished Scholarship in recognition of the groundbreaking nature of her research. She has worked closely with the Mark Twain House Museum for almost 20 years and served on its board of trustees from 2017 to 2023. Born in New York City, Bob Hirst received his bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1963. He then relocated to the Bay Area, entering the PhD program in English at UC Berkeley. Bob began working in the Mark Twain Papers as a graduate student and completed his doctoral dissertation on the making of the Innocents Abroad, 1867 to 1876, under the supervision of Henry Nash Smith in 1976. In 1980, Bob was appointed general editor of the Mark Twain Papers Project, a position he held for 45 years, until his retirement in September of 2025. During his distinguished decades-long tenure as general editor, he shepherded over 30 authoritative critical editions of Mark Twain's works into print, including 3 volumes of the writer's autobiography. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kerry Driscoll and Dr. Bob Hirst.
In his 1841 essay, Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson famously stated that an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. More applicable words have never been spoken about the institution we're discussing this evening, the Mark Twain Papers Project, the world's largest repository of the writer's letters, manuscripts, notebooks, photographs, and other ephemera, which is housed at the Bancroft Library at the University of California, Berkeley. More specifically, our focus is on that one man whose leadership and vision have played a central role in shaping the Mark Twain Papers and Projects over his extraordinary 45-year career as general editor, Robert H. Hirst. So my first question to you, Bob, is my most general one, and that is, what exactly are the Mark Twain Papers, and how do they end up in Berkeley?
Yes, you may imagine I've been asked that question many times, so I do have an answer. I hope it isn't too long. Mark Twain appointed his own biographer in 1907, Albert Bigelow Paine. There's an early Paine and a later Paine, you can see. He put into Paine's hands an enormous archive of his own, including roughly 700 manuscripts, literary manuscripts, the autobiography, 17,000 letters to Mark Twain, 50 notebooks. It goes on and on, long list of things. He put those into Paine's hand, and basically Paine made use of them to write his biography, his 3-volume biography, but he was in general disinclined to publish them. I guess I would say that defines the papers as they were created in 1907, but by the time they came to Berkeley, which was 1949, they were still pretty much intact. Mark Twain wrote his will in such a way that Clara, his only surviving daughter, could not change the ownership of the papers except through her own will. She had to die in order to make a change. That kept things together. It was Mark Twain's idea this would prevent her from being taken advantage of by men, but that didn't work. The papers did, however, stay together. And once they came to Berkeley in 1949, they were added to regularly.
With this guy, by the way, Dixon Wechter.
Yeah.
So
I'm sorry I didn't get to mention that Devoto was the second editor. He had criticized Paine for not letting anybody see them. So the lawyers who were in charge of the papers decided to oil the squeaky wheel, and they named Devoto, who was not really a faculty member at Harvard, but they allowed him to have 2 rooms in Widener Library. I don't know if anybody even knows what that means. If you were a faculty member, you did not get rooms in Widener Library. And although he only spent 8 years editing the Mark Twain papers, he did an enormous amount of organizing and tried to publish things. He tried to publish, for instance, Letters from the Earth. Clara, who is still alive, of course, said no. That shows my father's disrespect for the Bible, which it certainly did. And so it was not really published until Clara died in 1962, and it has never been out of print since then. So he was a sort of interim figure. When he resigned 15 or 16 times, and eventually he did in fact resign, and in favor of the next guy, you can turn him, Dixon Wechter, who was an American historian established, who wanted to write a biography of Mark Twain, and he realized that these papers, especially exclusive access to them, gave him a big advantage in trying to write a biography. So he was centered in the Huntington, down south in California, also teaching at UCLA. He stayed there for several years, but he pretty soon got interest in having a position at Berkeley. And so the history department said, well, come on up, we'll give you a job. That was 1949. That's how they did things in 1949, no longer. And so he asked Clara, can I bring the papers with me? And she said, yes, you can do that for 10 years. And then he got together with President Sproul of the university, and they cooked up the idea of changing where the papers would ultimately be deposited. Clara's notion in her will was that they would go to Yale. Yale had given Mark Twain an honorary degree in 1888. That was very important to the family, which is a little doubtful at what their paterfamilias was doing was anything called literature. Well, if Yale says you're a good guy, that changes things. In any case, Wechter was a big, tall Texan, very courtly, and he knew how to deal with Clara. And literally in the month that he comes to Berkeley, June 1949, he writes her and says, I really think you should change your will and give the papers to the University of California. And she writes back in the same week, I'll send you a codicil next week. That was that. She did, in fact, send the codicil. They became technically indebted. I mean, that is, when she died, they would go to UC. The papers would go, but not the copyright. The copyright would stay in her possession. That's an important difference. What else should we talk about there?
well, let's move on to
Okay.
So the next, all right, curator and general editor is Henry Nash Smith, followed by Frederick Anderson. And you can see the tenure of each of these people. And it was Frederick Anderson's sudden death in 1979 that led to someone that you know becoming the 6th general editor and curator
We
of
want
Mark
you to
Twain's
see what happens to you if you edit Mark Twain.
So you, as Mallory mentioned, you were by no means new to the papers, having worked there for a number of years as a graduate student. But please tell us a bit about the state of the archive as you found it in 1980.
Well, in 1980, there was something of a crisis. It was quiet and but real, and it was very much on my plate as soon as I took the job. The archive itself was, I would say, in a very limping condition. There were 8 editors, not all full-time. There was one only typewriter. It was a manual typewriter. You had trouble finding a place to sit down. It was in such crowded quarters. Access to the collection was through a card file. There was no such thing as a catalog of, let's say, the letters, the 17,000 letters incoming. A lot of work needed to be done simply to make it accessible to anyone who needed it. There were lots of visitors to Mark Twain's papers, but in fact, it was pretty hard to get into them and to find out what you needed at that stage. The real crisis, however, was caused by the state of the publication program. Should I go on about that?
Well, you can briefly.
Okay. Well, there were two separate editions of Mark Twain. One was the works of Mark Twain, which had been begun at Iowa City in 1962. They really were the first literary edition to get started in the United States. And they paid a price for being first because they had no models to follow, and they made a lot of mistakes. They were founded in 1964 with a grant from the United States Office of Education, about $180,000. They appointed 22 editors, took that money and distributed it to the editors, and said, go away and do your job and come back and we'll publish this edition. Their notion of an edition was fairly simple. Take a first edition, reprint it, and supply some notes. There was no effort on their part to do what would be called textual editing, to make an attempt to get that text as accurate and as close to what the author wanted as possible. That requires a different kind of editing, a different kind of patience, and a different kind of intelligence, it turned out.
So actually, that's a perfect lead into my next question, and that is, why is scholarly textual editing important? And I'd like you to specifically talk about that using the example of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer.
Sure. I'll put some slides up there?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Well, the Iowa edition had trouble getting anything published because they wouldn't adhere to the kind of textual theory that was being supported by the Modern Language Association with money that came from the National Endowment for the Humanities. They insisted on a very different principle, which the MLA simply wouldn't fund. But by 1980, a number of things had changed. A lot of the work, especially on texts, had been moved to Berkeley. And it had been moved to Berkeley because Fred Anderson, whom you saw, had been hiring graduate students like me and like Mike Frank and Ken Sanderson and Harriet Smith, people who were going to get a PhD in English, but were probably not too happy with the way the department was treating them. In any case, they were offered this job that allowed them to be in the midst of this enormous archive and to basically have free access to it in every possible way. Fred also really didn't know how to edit, and neither did we. We weren't taught how to edit in graduate school. It's just not what the graduate program included. So we taught ourselves. And because we were resident, we were in the papers all the time, we very quickly began to know more about the papers than almost anyone else. And we also began to learn more about editing than the people at Iowa. All the editors at Iowa, all 22 of them, have been chosen not because they knew anything about editing, but because they had subject specialty in the books that they were assigned to. So this is actually the last gasp of the Iowa project. It's an edition of Tom Sawyer that we're talking about. This is just a page from the manuscript that was set before the printer who published the first edition of Tom Sawyer. And this is just one page, of course. I was looking at it because when the Iowa people published their edition of Tom Sawyer, they did not include the illustrations. As a matter of principle, they did not include the illustrations. But we were trying to produce something called the Mark Twain Library, which was derived from the scholarly edition. It didn't have all the technical apparatus in it, but it had the full text, a lot of notes, and the illustrations. So to put Tom Sawyer into the Mark Twain Library, it was necessary to reset parts of it and to insert the illustrations. And I said that if we're going to reprint this, I'm going to have to check to make sure that it's accurate before I do that. It's expensive to reprint. And so I basically sat down with the manuscript and their edition and proofread back and forth against the manuscript. As we would expect, Mark Twain is reading proof, and he makes changes. The typesetter also makes changes. The typesetter feels it's his job to decide how the punctuation and the spelling should go. Mark Twain did not quite approve of that. In fact, he, for a lifetime, basically protested against such things. In any case, this is just an example of a change in wording that would ordinarily be thought of as a clear authorial change, because it is a change of wording, not of punctuation. If you could read the manuscript, I've transcribed it over there. The boys' hearts had stood still, and their hearts and their bodies too, when the man moved, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when that was put into the first edition, the word bodies became the word hopes.
Go figure.
And they accepted that. They thought that must have been Mark Twain, since it's such a verbal change. But they really ought to have been much more suspicious. It's not a synonym, it's a big change in the meaning of the word. And as I was proofreading, what jumped out at me was that because of the way it was inserted between two existing lines, the word bodies looked a lot like the word hopes. At least it did if you were familiar with Mark Twain's handwriting. And that would argue, you see, that the change was not something that the author deliberately imposed. It was a change that the typesetter made, not even thinking he was making a change. This is actually a fairly common sort of thing in editing. Here's another example in Tom Sawyer Abroad, where the word powwow is misconstrued as proud man by the typesetter, not by Mark Twain. Mark Twain is not changing powwow to proud man. So I just wanted to make sure you see that that's not a unique and rare thing. It's actually a fairly common thing. And it is one of the things that a textual editor must be aware of and be alert to in these editing.
To go back to the authority of the original manuscript and avoid these kind of errors. So there's a close-up of the two words in question.
I mean, textual editing, I guess, has a kind of aura of mystery about it, but really it's not mysterious. If you've ever played telephone in a party, where you form a line and you speak a message to each person, and then each person relays it to the next person. And by the time it gets to the end of the line, it's a totally different word. And that's just a normal aspect of all textual transmission. If you write a letter to the editor, can you get it published the way you wrote it? Most newspapers will not do that. Everybody, there's always somebody who knows more about how you want to say something than you do. And Mark Twain was very sensitive to this. He objected vociferously, but usually without result, to the way typesetters and typists would change his text.
When you began as general editor in 1980, 3 volumes of Mark Twain's letters, produced under the direction of your predecessor, Fred Anderson, were already in galley proofs, so they were right on the verge of being published. You soon realized that these volumes were beset by problems. For 2 years, you and your staff valiantly tried to correct these issues, but eventually discovered it was impossible. This situation led to one of your most consequential and controversial decisions, scrapping the 3 volumes of letters and starting anew from scratch. Would you please tell us about this?
Yeah, I think I can talk about it. A little painful, but I'll talk about it. This decision is often sort of talked about as my perfectionism and so forth. That really is not the case, although I am a perfectionist and it's very annoying to some people, my wife included. But in this case, what had happened was that Fred, who's our boss, was under a lot of pressure from NEH to expedite the publication of these editions. The NEH was supporting both the works and the papers in a very modest way. They were not giving a lot of money, but they were giving us the money to actually to get some things done. And just before I came to this job, we had published our edition of Connecticut Yankee, we published an edition of Prince and the Pauper, and something called Early Tales and Sketches, which I had a little bit to do with. And we also were just about to publish Tom Sawyer. So he's under pressure to hurry up. And what he does is to promise the NEH to publish 3 volumes of letters in a year, edit and publish in a year. He also is assaulted by 2 local professors who come to him and talk their way into being the editors of these volumes. They are inexperienced, they have very little experience with Mark Twain, but they're very good talkers, and they talked Fred into getting what he called free labor, because they were professors, someone else would pay them, he didn't have to pay them, they would do the job. Unfortunately, he had to do this so rapidly that he told them they needed to cooperate with the graduate students who were in the papers, who were well-versed in how to edit letters, but much more well-versed than the professors were. We used to call the professors the king and the duke for obvious reasons. They declined to collaborate with the graduate students. And I think that actually is a theme that I'm trying to suggest here. The editors, the graduate students in the Mark Twain papers were without credentials. They didn't have PhDs. Most of them didn't have more than a BA. But they did have deep experience and knowledge of the materials. The people at Iowa were all professors. They were all PhDs. But they had no grasp, no understanding of what textual editing was all about. And so there really was a lot of tension between these 2 groups and made for really bad results in the books that they were both involved with. In the case of these letters, they had gone forward with 3 volumes, they had typeset 3 volumes of letters without ever doing a search. And yet a guy named Thomas Tenney was out in the world, walking, driving around the country, visiting libraries and finding Mark Twain letters, and every time he'd find a Mark Twain letter, he'd copy it and send it to us. And by the time the 3rd volume was ready to go into pages, Mike Frank, who was the editor, had to add 65 letters. And that tells you not just that there are 65 more letters that they had missed, it means that the previous volumes, the earlier volumes, also were missing many, many letters that they shouldn't have been missing. There are many other failings of these volumes, and it was a sticky situation until finally the NEH said, look, we hear you're going ahead without doing a search. We think you shouldn't edit letters without a search. And I told them I agree with that, but I couldn't change anything because I had these proofs. Then the press came to me and they said, well, the typesetter is about to go bankrupt. So we'd like it if you decided to kind of junk the proofs and start over. That did it. I didn't call a council of war. I didn't consult my boss. I didn't consult my wife. I should have, but I didn't. I just decided, okay, we're going to start over. That was not a popular decision.
Well, and one of the major considerations in this decision was the desire to reproduce as accurately and fully as possible the unique qualities of Mark Twain's letters, which were very much influenced by his experiences as a printer and a typesetter. This ultimately led to Bob's invention of a new method of transcription that he calls plain text. And so I'm going to ask him to walk you now through a series of slides where he talks about some of these unique features that had not been reproduced in earlier editions of the letters because people didn't quite know what to make of them. So,
well, this
first one has to do with underscoring and emphasis.
Yeah. Well, let me just back up and say that once I decided that we were going to start over, I told the editors to go away and redo the annotation, and also to ask Ed Branch, the person who knew more about Mark Twain in the West, to join them. He was a professor in Ohio and a partner of mine. What I did was to start in looking at these proofs, looking for the things that they were having trouble transcribing, or that they were not transcribing accurately and consistently. This is just one little page from a love letter by Mark Twain. He's writing to Livy very early in their courtship. Why, Livy, oh, Charlie, don't scare a body like that way. I always look at the end of a letter first to see how it's signed, because the mood of the writer crops out there, and you know what to expect. And behold, here was your entire name displayed in frozen and awful solemnity. I expected what I so love to see, and if I must confess with lack of decorum, kiss, viz. Love lovingly Livy, and found, as I thought, only Livy L. Langdon. What jumped out at me about this was the way in which he writes this, the way in which he underscores it. He wants to emphasize the L, so it's Livy L. Langdon, but in fact, he puts only one underscore under the L, or there are two underscores under Langdon. So that sort of seems backwards if you're just counting underlines. What it showed me, however, was that Mark Twain was so familiar with the standard way to show emphasis that he knew that there was only one level of emphasis higher than capital L, and that's italic capital L. So that, in fact, he has shown, this is what a printer would do. That's what a printer would do with this in Mark Twain's time. Now, we're not saying that Livy knew anything about this. I'm just saying that this is so automatic in his part that he's using something that doesn't look to us intuitively correct. It is correct. Try the next one. Here's something that appears not often, but enough often so that it puzzled the authors. What is that thing? Any ideas? Well, my editors were in debate about it. Some of them said, well, it looks like a blank with a comma in front and a comma in back. Or it looks like a dash with a comma on either side. Well, it turns out that this is a standard way of inserting a dash. It's a proofreading mark that Mark Twain must have learned as a typesetter and that he must have seen dozens of times in his own work. And yet, current knowledge on the part of these very experienced editors left them blank. They did not know what it was. And in fact, if I looked at the earlier publication of either of these things, I found out that Payne and Wechter and Devoto also did not know what it was. This is also starting to kind of tell me that typesetting, printing is very important to Mark Twain. Okay? This is a little more complicated. This comes not from the letters, but from the notebooks, and it's something we published in 1975. What's happening is that Mark Twain says, our term star, I have often wondered what it could suggest it. And he goes on to explain that he's looking at a program for Lohengrin, in which, let's go to the transcription, Gil. Sure. In which he sees that the glede, Lohengrin, is opposite what he calls, what is an asterisk. That's his asterisk. And that the asterisk leads you to the bottom, where Lohengrin is identified. The star is identified. And that's how we transcribed it. It's obviously that we think something is going on because we're reproducing the asterisk in facsimile. Why? There was a simple thing that we didn't know. Mark Twain's term for asterisk is star, as all printers would call an asterisk a star. What he's saying is, because the lead is identified by a star, that's how our term star, meaning lead or famous person, was created. Now, it's not a correct etymology, it's a folk etymology, but I think the simple fact is because we did not really appreciate how fully Mark Twain's mind was invested with typographical material and words, we simply did not know how to transcribe this. Let's go to the next one. Another aspect of transcribing Mark Twain's letters, which was up for debate once I started revising the transcription policy, there were editors on my staff who thought that the transcriptions, that the cancellations should be reduced. They should be taken out and listed in the back at most. And I think that was just a fundamentally wrong way to go at it. And I'm giving you this example just so you can see how normal it is for Mark Twain to send out a letter that is fully revised with all kinds of cancellations and insertions. He's sending it to a man named Whitlaw Reid, who's the editor of the New York Tribune. You and I'm pretty sure, would recopy this. We wouldn't want Mr. Reid to see the way we had changed our mind. But Mark Twain was actually quite willing for people to, almost eager for people to see that. And in this case, because there's so much of it, he calls attention to it. He says, P.S. I always write too much for a businessman to read, so I've crossed some out and interlined more. And if you don't, if that doesn't prompt you to want to read those cancellations, you're just not in the same boat. Okay, so cancellations are important to Mark Twain, and you cannot properly transcribe his letters if you leave them out. There are many editions of letters which do leave them out, or they simply list them in the back of the book. I say that those editions should carry a warning sign, the way certain toys carry a certain warning sign. Some assembly required. Now, this is a sort of a special cancellation. In this case, he didn't cross anything out. He simply tore the paper off. He tore the text out and sent the torn pages in the letter. This is to his fiancée, who is, of course, trying to convert him. She's trying to make him a proper Christian. And so he knows, and she knows, that she's trying to read these cancellations because they're revelatory. They will tell her something about the state of his soul. Mark Twain knows that that's happening. In any case, he sends this, and of course, she replies and questions what was in that missing passage. This is part of his reply. Go to the next one, yeah. I'm going to have to stand up in order to read it. This is what I call a cancellation intended to be read. He is canceling it, but he is expecting her to decipher it. Okay? So he says, the confession, that's the thing I do. The confession I destroyed was that I had refused to deliver a lecture a week here for $600 because, oh, I can't tell it again. You would say I was a lovesick idiot. And between ourselves, I am. But then I could not be so reckless as to write the above if you had any curiosity in your composition. In other words, I wouldn't say that I was a lovesick idiot if you were going to uncover the cancellation and read it, right? So what's happened, of course, is if she does uncover the cancellation and read it, she will discover a confident statement that she would, of course, not do any such thing. Mark Twain is playing with his fiancée in a way which I think is rather subtle. What do you suppose that is? Oh, in brackets. Brackets tell you that the speaker has changed, like a side, or that's Livy when she discovers what the thing actually says. So I think you're probably very skeptical that we can read this, and you should be skeptical. We wouldn't publish a transcription if we couldn't get two editors independently to come up with the same answer. But there's one other way to think about this. Let's go to the next. I think it's the last. Well, this sort of shows you really how we begin to decipher a line. What are called the ascenders and the descenders and the dots on the I's with the J. Those are the first clues. They give you, they narrow the possibility of what is under that loopy loop. It'd be a lot easier to see this if I could show you a slide that doesn't muddy up the cancellations as much as these do. But one more text.
Next one.
Yeah, last one. This is a later letter. She is trying to get him to stop drinking, but he's out on lecture tour, and one of the things that happens on a lecture tour is that you have to be entertained or you have to entertain their hosts. And so he starts out in this piece of the letter. Those are fine fellows at Lockport, but they stole a march on me. I entertained about 15, and he stops, crosses it all out, and then says, that's the way to scratch it out, my precious little solemnity, when you find you written what you didn't mean to write. Don't you see how neat it is and how impenetrable? Kiss me, Livy, please. I think what's interesting about this is that he has developed a way to prevent somebody from reading it. He has imposed over the loopy-loop false ascenders and descenders, things that are not actually part of the words underneath. He's crossed the L's so they look like T's. And if you don't know that that's what he's doing, you never will read this passage. She didn't ever read it, that's for sure.
There you go.
Well, this is just another attempt to give you a little better view of what it looks like to us and how we begin to kind of piece it out. It's not as if you can see literally every letter. That isn't what happened. You can't take ink eradicator and remove the canceling line. No, that doesn't happen. But you have basically lots of clues, including the clue of a coherent sentence as the rules of English language. So this is in many ways like a double cross stick, if you've ever done those for the New York Times. As I say, we wouldn't publish anyone that we thought was just, just one person's guess at it. We had to have confirmation. You can see that the 15 at the bottom there has, 3 Fs.
So I mentioned that this decision to scrap the letters and that led to the development of plain text transcription was controversial. And so we wanted to give you a sample of some of the critical reaction. And rather than craning my neck, I'm going to read this from my printout. So in 1984, a prominent Mark Twain scholar sent the following letter to Henry Nash Smith and the Bancroft Library director. The change of the enterprise from the Mark Twain Papers to the Mark Twain Project reflects an obsessive concern with the various predominantly theoretical volumes in the series to the detriment of scholarship and research. A tragic deterioration has occurred in the papers during Hirst's tenure as director, and that both University of California and the National Endowment for the Humanities have cause for serious concern about its image, its effectiveness, and its method. Four years later, in 1988, Professor Ralph Orth, a University of Vermont English professor who edited Emerson's journals, made a site visit out to the Mark Twain Papers in Berkeley and sent an official report of his findings to NEH. I'm just going to read a few excerpts of this. The edition of Mark Twain's letters, the first volume of which is about to appear, is a good example of Mr. Hirst's method of operation. When he became director in January 1980, the first 3 volumes of letters, prepared by 3 previous editors, were already in type. So we already know this history, so I can skip a little. So they decided to, the letters needed to be re-edited completely. So far, so good. But Mr. Hirst came to believe that he needed to devise a new method of presenting the text, one which he eventually called plain text, a process which took from 1983 until early 1987. This, in my opinion, was a very unfortunate and unnecessary decision, since clear text, with or without textual appendixes, has been successfully used for the definitive editions of the letters of Cooper, Emerson, Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Longfellow, Whitman, et al., and there has been no noticeable clamor for a different method. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Orth continues. I need more hands here. Also contributing to the length of time needed to get the letters underway was the decision to annotate the first volume to a degree unprecedented, so far as I am aware, in American literary scholarship.
That's not a compliment.
The notes themselves often exceed by a considerable margin the text of the letters themselves, with copious annotations from newspaper articles and other sources. Obviously, readers will differ on the amount of annotation they want, but considering the circumstances and the fact that there are 10,000 additional letters to edit and annotate, leanness would seem to be the obvious choice. If, under whatever circumstances are decided upon, the project does not enhance its productivity over the next few years, the endowment should bite the bullet and end funding. It will, after all, have gotten some return on the investment through volumes already published, and will have the solace of knowing that it is able to fund other worthy projects which it must reject at present. So, it was hard times. Oops, I'm sorry, I went too far. Eventually, vindication came. Other later NEH reviewers said this: there is no question about the excellence of these volumes or about their importance to the study of Mark Twain and of American literature and culture. The only issue is whether they are worth the cost. I believe they are. The Mark Twain Project is simply the best ongoing editorial project in the country. Its methods and accuracy have set the standard for scholarly editions, and it is unrivaled in making the fruits of scholarship available to a wide public. The endowment will have a shelf of books it can be proud of long after other lesser projects have been funded and forgotten. I recommend it with, as Mark Twain put it, the confidence of a Christian with 4 aces. Finally, the editorial methodology developed, meticulously and painfully by the project's permanent staff is in itself a major contribution to scholarship, creating a model for other projects and setting a standard of excellence that may well put this country in the forefront of textual scholarship worldwide. The project's editorial methodology lays the groundwork for textual editing of the first rank. For this alone, if for no other reason, the project should be continued. I give this proposal the strongest possible recommendation. And then just lastly, to close, there's this from Ron Chernow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning author who wrote the 2025 biography of Mark Twain. To my mind, the Mark Twain Papers and Project is one of the greatest scholarly achievements of our time, providing researchers with the richest and most rounded portrait of Mark Twain imaginable. In crafting my own biography, I always regarded Bob and the Mark Twain Papers as the gold standard, the court of last resort, whenever controversy or difficulties arose. So now we invite questions.
Don't be shy.
How do you all integrate the critical editions you all publish with the ongoing Library of America editions of Twain's work?
The editions that we publish are readily available without cost to the Library of America and actually to any other publisher. That's part of the deal you make with NEH. You're paying public money to do these critical editions, and there's no reason in the world why Library of America or any other publisher should need to pay twice over for it. They've already paid their taxes. So the Library of America, of course, does not use the illustrations. It does not use anything like the level of annotation that we supplied. And as far as I know, they haven't yet begun to publish letters. So you're talking really about publishing Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer, et cetera, et cetera. I've worked very closely with other editors on the Library of America, given them texts that were edited by us, but not yet published, so that they could have the best possible text to reprint. Their basic job is to take a reliable text, usually the first edition, reprint it exactly, and publish it. And also to keep it permanently in print. That's their goal. They are, in fact, the culmination of something that Edmund Wilson wanted to do back in 1967 when he saw NEH money going to the Modern Language Association instead of to him to do his play-out edition. Does that answer the question? Yes.
Well, I have thank you. Sure. I have a little off course from the editing background that you've been discussing. I'm a casual acquirer of for early editions of Mark Twain. He's I call him my spiritual mentor because I write and I use his spirit often, I think. Anyway, what I have found is that even during his lifetime, there were so many more small books that were published, and I feel of not that great consequence. And I'm just wondering if his editors and publishers realize the importance of selling his work, and just about anything that he wrote turned into a book, even if it's only a tiny little pamphlet. And I'm always finding these little gems in the marketplace.
Well, I'm not quite sure what kind of gems you're talking about. If they have published, let's say, after his life, after he's dead, that's one thing. The copyrights on his books, all of his books, everything he ever published, ended in 1934. Anything that was not published for then is still copyrightable. Most of the things that we publish are copyrightable, not Connecticut Yankee. Yankee it's published in 1889. Its copyright is gone, can't be renewed. What you're talking about, and I can't quite be sure, are little reprints of anecdotes and funny sayings that he is known for that get made and put into the world without anybody objecting. Probably because they do not violate the copyright. Probably because whatever they're quoting or reprinting is out of copyright. But I can't be sure until I know exactly what you're talking about.
Can you give us a title off the top of your head?
No, it's okay. Well, I mean, there's a whole industry of micro, a Bible this big. I mean, that, there are printers and people who collect things that's beyond my understanding, but that's what they do, right? So it doesn't surprise me that there are Mark Twain stuff in that, in these kinds of. Well, if they are done during his lifetime, either they are piracies or they are printing something which is out of copyright. He was himself pretty ferocious about protecting his copyright. And so were his successor editors, that is to say, the lawyers who were managing Clara's will. Clara's the last surviving daughter. She owns the papers. She owns the copyright. And they, if somebody, there are several people who collected his letters, put them together, and published them in the book. The estate is on them like they just withdraw that book. You can't get any copies of it. So they're very aggressive in that way, and they are still so, frankly. If you were to try to publish something that was protected, a lot of things are protected, you would hear from them.
Oh, we have a question in the back.
I always enjoy hearing from you and your wonderful organization, and I know it's something that you're interested in. When is the next edition of Innocents Abroad going to appear?
How embarrassing. I wrote my dissertation about Innocents Abroad in 1976. And so, whether I wanted to or not, I am the designated editor of Innocents Abroad. But when I took this job in 1980, it very quickly became clear that I did not have time to work on anything of my own. I had actually had my dissertation accepted by Nebraska. They wanted me to revise it and cut it. I simply had no time to do that. And so actually, my time has been entirely spent in facilitating the publication of other editors' works. I could not spend time on Innocents. It's a more complicated story that I'm giving, partly, and I don't want to do it here because it's full of nasty exchanges between editors who are unhappy with me and unhappy with their fate. But one of the reasons I retired was that so I can get some real work done. And I have been working on Innocents since September last year. And I expect we will have it done in a year, and it will be out. So it won't never be out. It won't be out as soon as we would like, but it will be out. Does that answer the question?
Bob,
Yes.
I've just realized I was supposed to ask you a question about our three props up here, and that is the gargantuan 3-volume complete autobiography. So just before another audience question, do you want to say a little about the challenges of both editing these volumes and then publishing them?
Well, I'll do my best because I really don't have slides to illustrate it, and it is, I'm afraid, a ferociously complicated textual situation. Most textual situations are simple. The manuscript is copied by the typist. The typist's product is revised by the author. He hands that to the typesetter. The typesetter sets it up as well as he can and throws it away. So you're generally speaking, with the printed edition and the manuscript, but not the typescript on which most revision has occurred. So you have to figure out how Mark Twain revised his text on that typescript, which you can do if you know a lot about Mark Twain and if you're very careful in how you compare the manuscript and the printed text. The autobiography was not like that. And it stumped the editors, including me, for a long time. I'm publicly on record as saying that Mark Twain never finished it, because that's what I thought. But my editors, much smarter than I am, and much harder working than I am, and they figured out, oh no, he had finished it. He knew exactly what he wanted in it and exactly what he did not want in it. Why was there any question about what he wanted in it? Well, I'll make it kind of simpler, but basically he decides he's going to dictate the text. And he has a very good person taking down this dictation, takes it down, goes home, types it up, brings it back the next day, and gives it to him. And what we have in the files are these typescripts that are only filed by date. They don't have a title. They don't have anything else identifying them as, a particular text except the date. And in, let's say, the first couple of folders, January 12th, 1906, are 3 or maybe 4 versions of this text. And what's distinctive about them is that they have very different page numbers. One has a page number of 19. One has a page number of 536. One has a page number of 1236. This was a very puzzling situation. Why would these things have different numbers like that? Was he moving this text around? We really did not know. And I would say that this is a classic case where the only way to solve it is to develop what we do for all of our editions, a very detailed, hour by hour, day by day account of the way he writes it. That's recorded and pulled out of letters he writes at the time, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things we eventually discovered was that he'd gotten fairly far into the autobiography before he decided, well, I really need a second copy. But because typing was cheap, he simply had her retype the copy. He didn't, he didn't use carbon paper. Okay? In addition, as he goes along, he decides to add things to the front, and that starts to extend the number of pages that are in this text. In any case, once you figure that out, you realize that if these separately paged texts were left the way he left them, here's the first version, here's the second version, here's the third version, you wouldn't have been mystified by it at all. But people taking care of them, curators, decided, well, they're all of the same date, so they all go in one folder. They took apart the coherent typescripts that had existed. So once that was solved, it became clear pretty much what he wanted. Now, that's not the whole thing. It turned out that there are several holograph pages, which we reproduce in the first volume, that he has designed to be at the front of the book to tell you exactly what comes here and what comes next. And Paine, who had published a very truncated version of the whole autobiography, has changed the page numbering on them to suit his own notion of what these are for. Once you restore the page numbers in the order to which they were originally, you can begin to figure out exactly how this text is supposed to begin and exactly how the rest of it is to go. This is an example of, I think it's page 3 of that holograph stuff. It says, here insert the 44 old typewritten pages. Yeah, that's good if you know what those are. And of course, it took a while to figure out, oh yeah, we do have those. We don't have the original ones, but we have a copy that was made from them. And we know, because it's the same length, 44 pages, we know that it fits from other images. All of a sudden, we have a clear pattern for how the book is to be published. It was, I think, even a revelation to us that when we published the first volume, we expected 8,000 copies. It sold 500,000 copies in a year. And that's because Mark Twain has an enormous hidden audience, an audience that I will never meet, an audience that is impossibly large and basically unnoticed. And they are his fans. And when the autobiography was published, they decided they want that. I have to admit that there must have been a number of grandfathers who got this for a present and never read it, but that's not the real story. The real story is that this volume, which is a scholarly volume, it's got lots of very serious matters in it, and maybe not everyone's taste. I would say definitely not everyone's taste. But there were a lot of people who read this and loved it. One of the things you need to know about it is that it's not a chronological narrative. He doesn't say, I was born in 1835 and blah, blah, blah. No, absolutely not. He wants to junk that form of autobiography. He says, I'm going to stand up and talk about what I ever want to talk about. As soon as I get bored, I'm going to change the subject. And he does. And so there's no reason why you shouldn't just open it, start reading where you open it. Read until you get bored, and then skip, as he did. It's a very different form of writing. It's more like watching him stand up and talk, and he is the world's greatest talker.
Other questions?
Yeah, we're going to throw it to Rebecca. She has a couple of questions from the online audience.
Yes, changing the subject. John says, please ask Bob what 3 thoughts would he want high school students to know about Mark Twain and or Huck Finn, and I will convey them to all my students every year.
Okay. I think the first thought is you should be using our edition of Huckleberry Finn. And I'm not kidding. Our edition, probably the paperback form of it, is probably $12. So it gets priced out of all high schools. When a high school teacher comes to me and says, I want to use your edition, I give them a supply of books because I want it to be in the high schools. Why do I want it to be in the high schools? Well, it's not so much because that text is a lot more accurate and purer than, let's say, the first edition text. There are maybe 300 words that are added to the text that were left out of the first edition because the typist made a mistake, or because the proofreader decided he couldn't do this, or because Mark Twain marks up one of the bills that the king and the duke are selling their wares with, and the typist can't produce the capitals and small capitals, and so it goes into print without those. We can restore that. Okay, but it's not really that I think is what's important. When we want to do this kind of editing, we create this very, very detailed account of day by day how it was written and what's going on and who has a chance to do this and where it is and whether it goes to Howells and comes back. We know exactly how that book got into the printer's hands. Right? And that generates information about him and about the text. So, for instance, we know Huck Finn. I don't know if you can tell your students all this, but I hope you can try anyway. Huck Finn, he writes the whole thing out in longhand, and then he has it typed. And he has it typed because he wants to revise it. And he's saying these are double spaced, just like you would type it, right? And even though we don't have that typescript, we can reconstruct it. We can reconstruct it because we can compare the manuscript with the thing that was set from it. So if the word axe is spelled A-X-E in the manuscript, and it's spelled A-X in the book, that's probably not him. Mark Twain is not interested in changing the spelling of axe. But if there's a word change, or if there's a phrase change, or if there's anything very particularly his, that's his, okay? So in the back of our book, we do several examples of this is the way the text was in manuscript, this is the way the text was once it was revised on the typescript. And so you can see all the revisions. The classic one, and the really one that I think you should show your students, is Huck's description of the sunrise on the Mississippi. It's a famous, famous passage, which critics have been praising forever for all kinds of reasons. And if they were to look at this demonstration, which is in the back of our book, they would see that all of the things that those critics have been praising were achieved in revision. And I think that's something that as students, they should take to heart. Now, I don't know how many examples that is or things that it is that you're going to tell those students, but that's the drift that I would take. And I have to say, I do think Huck Finn tends to be taught too early, before students are grown up enough to really take it in. After all, this is one of the most vivid anti-racist books written in the 19th century. But it cannot be read aloud today. There's something wrong with that. Did I answer the question?
I think you did. He says, I am using the Mark Twain Papers edition, and smiley face. We have one more question online.
Far away.
What in the mass of accumulated Mark Twain papers and ephemera, big or small, surprised you? This is from Joe.
Well, I have to say I'm continuously surprised. I mean, there's not any day that something doesn't surprise me. I mean, if you're finding a letter a week, you're seeing things which haven't been seen in hundreds of years. And we haven't seen them. We've seen a lot, let me tell you that. But we haven't seen the things that come across my desk. And so the fact of the matter is, reading somebody's mail is a way to find out about them. It doesn't tell you everything, but it sure can surprise you. Let me see if I can think of you a simple example. A letter that was given to us. It was written to someone that the owners didn't recognize. He actually was the editor of Harper's Weekly. And Mark Twain is writing back to him and explaining why he is not going to write short stories anymore. The editors asked for a short story. And he's saying basically it takes so much effort and the return is so little monetarily that it just doesn't pay. He says sometimes if I start writing a short story, it grows into something bigger that I can use. Huck Finn was an example of that, he said. I don't think anyone before this had known that Mark Twain thought of Huck Finn in its early days as a short story. That's just a small example.
I think we have a time.
In case it isn't clear, my job was a lot of fun.
I think we have time for one or two more questions if anyone has any last things. See a couple more.
So one question online. George, he asks, is it still fun for you to be surprised by Mark Twain every day after 45 years?
Short answer, yes. It's great fun. This is an extraordinary person. You know, unlike you and me, Mark Twain isn't perfect. But he is infinitely interesting. He is someone of an extraordinary intellect and an extraordinary experience. So I've been doing this for 50 years. I'm not bored. I can't quit. I'm going to work every day. That's why I retired, so I can go to work.
You've acknowledged Twain's greatness, and I think it's a given that you approached your work with professionalism and a concern for a positive outcome. but how much over the course of time would you say Twain himself inspired or augmented the tenacity that you revealed with regard to getting it right all the time? Is it something separate? Did you always have that attitude, or did it grow because of the work and the man and the way you felt possibly concerned in revealing him the way he needed to be revealed?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll try to answer it. You tell me if I don't understand it, okay? As a graduate student, I was working for Fred Anderson. And one of our jobs was to check the work of professors who were doing editing of the text. And we didn't know anything about editing. We almost didn't know anything about Mark Twain. But in this process of checking, we discovered that it was very, very common for these professors to get the facts completely wrong. Here's an example. Roughing It. In Roughing It, Mark Twain quotes several passages from the Book of Mormon. You may expect that he's going to make fun of the Mormons a little bit. But this editor said in his notes, the notes that I was trying to check, Mark Twain has made subtle changes in the Mormon text to make fun of it. So I went to him. He was in the office that day, and I said, which edition of the Mormon Bible did you think Mark Twain used? I don't know. I don't know, he said. How would you know that Mark Twain changed something if you didn't know where he began? Do you see what I'm saying? So I would say that that experience pushed all of the graduate students that I was working with toward, well, let's be a little more careful. Let's be a little more thoughtful about what it is we call fact. And the simple fact is that the documentation around Mark Twain is enormous. It's overwhelming. And one of the consequences of that is that people get the facts wrong all the time. They just can't be careful enough. So we set up structures so that, I say it's this, but it doesn't go into print until somebody else checks it, right? Somebody else who didn't have anything to do with it. And they're happy to check it and find me wrong. We harness that. We harness the fact that there's a certain amount of competition between them. Now, I don't think that Mark Twain himself had a similar impulse. He is, in fact, driven by a much different kind of impulse. He loves to just jump into a story without solving the basic problems of it, and to write until he can't go on, right? The classic case for Huck Finn is, why would Jim go south? There's no reason for Jim to go. The reason for it is not to go south. It's the worst part of slavery, right? Mark Twain knows this is a problem, but he doesn't solve it, until quite far into the text. He expects, the story is, they're going to go down the Mississippi till they get to Cairo, where the Ohio comes in, then they're going to take the canoe and go up the Ohio to New York, and then eventually to Canada. The only problem with that is that Mark Twain doesn't know anything about the Ohio. He doesn't want to write about the Ohio. He wants to write about the Mississippi. And so he has to have them miss Cairo in the fog. And then he has to have them lose the canoe, because that would be a way to turn around and go back up the Ohio. And he has to think of a way to motivate their going south. So his first shot at this is, well, we're going to go on down the river and find another canoe. And then he forgets about that. Until, very far along in the book, he has been tinkering around with the idea of taking the Jim and Huck on shore so that they don't have to go south. They're going to visit the feud, they're going to visit all kinds of things in the culture. And he thinks of, well, they're two printers, and they practice feeling heads and all kinds of other, stuff. And he just makes a note of this, and then a little bit later, he comes back and says, keep them along. Keep them along. That's the solution. Because if they keep them along, they can make Jim and Huck go south, which is what they do. Now, he's so forgotten this. I mean, this is someone who doesn't pay attention to such details with, a lot of care. When he's printing the book, or about to print the book, at the point where the king and the duke show up for the first time, Huck says, I took the canoe and went across the street. And the proofreader comes along and says, see page 189, canoe lost. Can't take a canoe that you don't have. It's so close to printing that he has no alternative except to change took the to found the. I would say that tells you Mark Twain isn't too worried about such details. He has other fish to fry. And one of the things that he's sure of is that if I plan, humor will not emerge as easily. And that's why planning is secondary to him. He can plan. He can. Prince and the Pauper is planned to a fairly well. Right? Howell said about it, you could have been joking a little more, he said. And he was right. Does that answer the question? Or come close? We'll circle around and do it again sometime.
I just have to ask you to fill in the rest of that story about the Mormon Bible, right? The professor says, I don't know. And so what does Bob Hirst do?
Well, I mean, I didn't, I was naive as I could be. I mean, I went over to the Bancroft and I took out 12 editions of the Mormon Bible.
Everybody would do that, right?
And within 5 minutes, it became quite clear which text he had been using. And none of these changes were made by Mark Twain. They were made by the Mormons, or by the typesetter, or who knows, but not by Mark Twain. Right? But that story sticks in my head because I was completely naive. I was that guy you saw in the picture. I didn't know anything about anything, but I did know that if you want to prove to me that Mark Twain changed something, you have to show me what he began with. And the editor simply did not have that instinct. I think that's it tells you a little bit about the difference between the graduate students with no degrees and the professors who had status, et cetera, and had this, they were more worried about their public reputation than they were about getting Mark Twain's text right. Which is why, in 1980, one of the reasons, I made them into one edition. And I made myself the general editor of the whole edition. I tried to create a board to govern them. I asked the head of the board of the Iowa edition to join. He said, I don't want to join your super board. So he didn't. And that was a delicate matter because they had spent 2 decades working on this edition and they had only managed to get one book published and they were stuck. And the only problem with making it into one edition, both papers and works, was that the staff was not enlarged. It was the same small staff that had to deal then with both editions. But that had to do it that way because there was no other way. Thank you for these questions. I love them. Yes.
Can you pass the mic?
Thank you. I just read Innocents Abroad for the first time, and as I think about it, it was a version, I forget what year it was published, but had an afterword by Leslie Fiedler, who was Professor Samuel Clemens at SUNY Buffalo. Yeah. So my question is actually to you both. What is your approach as editors, scholars, fans, to statements that Mark Twain has made about Native Americans, African Americans? How do you annotate things like that when you are in a position, you are in a certain year in history, but you also have knowledge of the few decades before you and how those kinds of statements were interpreted? He made fun of everyone on the Quaker City. He made fun of everyone in that book. How do you contextualize the kinds of comments that he has made about Native Americans and African Americans?
I can start. I think one of the real dangers is in literary criticism is something called presentism, where you read a historical book through the lens of your own contemporary cultural moment, and that really leads to kind of erroneous impressions and conclusions. So it's a challenge to, first of all, avoid that pitfall, all right, and try to remember the historical context in which Mark Twain is living and writing. But on the subject of Native Americans, that's a really thorny one, and I spent a long time thinking about it and researching it, and I don't have a simple answer that I can give to you. I can certainly point you to my book where you can see. I mean, I think it's really important that Mark Twain's views about African Americans, which are contentious in their own right, it's why Huck Finn has been in hot water for a very long time, but they need to be evaluated in relation to his attitudes about American Indians, because then you can see a kind of spectrum, right? That, okay, well, if his views of African Americans are, flawed or limited, think about how they compare to some very retrograde statements about American Indians and their plight. So relatively speaking, he's far more progressive and open-minded in his views about blacks than he was about Native people. And I think that that's really useful to know. It gives you a more complete or a more comprehensive picture.
Yeah, let me just add to that the whole focus of a critical edition like ours is to get the text the way he wrote it, the way he wanted it. And so you're not sympathetic to somebody who says, "Whoa, this N-word, let's suppress that. Let's replace that with slave or something like that," which people have done.
Yeah.
I mean, whole editions of Huck Finn have been published with, substituting slave for N-word. Of course, you can't do that now because slave is no longer possible, right? I think it's important to realize that the editor's focus is on him and on getting his intention realized. And now it doesn't mean that we don't try to help, understand what's going on. So, for instance, we just recently published Pudd'nhead Wilson. Pudd'nhead Wilson is his second attempt to deal with slavery and racism in the South. And we, for the first time, wrote a kind of preface for this, warning people what was coming, warning people, giving them a brief history of how this word was treated in his lifetime, how he treated it, what he thought of it, and just warning them that his use of the word in this text is assigned to certain characters. It's never used by the narrator. It's never used by the author. Giving people a little bit of perspective on what it is he is actually doing to deal with this, because it's an issue in his lifetime as well. Mark Twain does not use N-word publicly after 1869. He's married to the daughter of an abolitionist of the first order. This is not someone who's, well, when people say to me that Mark Twain is a racist, I refer them to the passage in Huckleberry Finn where Huck is trying to fool Jim about whether they're being separated on the river is a dream or not. He makes Jim think it's a dream when it actually did happen. And then he pulls the rug out from Jim. He says, what's that trash there on the raft? Pointing to the fact of a real event. And Jim says, that there is trash. And trash is what people is to put dirt on the head of their friends and makes them ashamed. Turns around and walks into the wigwam. And Huck says, it took me 15 minutes, but I eventually made him apologize to the N-word, to the nigger. But I think anyone who reads that must grasp the fact that Mark Twain is inside Jim's head and has made Jim say that Huck is trash in a way which he can get away with. It's deniable, right? He doesn't say, Huck, you're trash. He says, that there is trash. And trash is what people is. It's not a direct comment on Huck. It's a comment on Huck, but it's not an accusation. So things like that can be pointed out, but I don't think that we're heavy on trying to guide people in this way. We're trying to kind of give them the real facts of what he actually wrote. We will also, talk about what he says in letters about black. I mean, Mark Twain is very clear about saying the white man has done this to blacks. It's his permanent responsibility. He cannot escape it. He's very clear about this and believes it. He is much more advanced even than members of his family. Very late in life, he's corresponding with a woman in France who is talking about Joan of Arc, and Mark Twain at some point allows that this Joan of Arc is not white in this written letter. And he hands it to his daughter, Jean, who is doing the typing. And she types it up, but she comes back and says, Father, you have to change it. Why? Why would I change? You've said that she's not white. I will not. God doesn't have any preference. He actually seems to prefer the colored kind, he said. So, I mean, this is his youngest daughter, right, who is more racist than he is. I think if you know things like that about Mark Twain, it's a lot easier to read Huck Finn accurately.
All right, well, unfortunately, I think that's the end. We're at the time, but please join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Kerry Driscoll and Dr. Bob Hirst. And thank you all very much for coming. Please enjoy the rest of your evening.